In our last episode on the war in Ukraine, we discussed how the Trump administration was pressuring the Zelensky government to agree to a ceasefire by pulling military funding and removing intelligence sharing. That tactic worked, and on March 11th, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz traveled back to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and sat down with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andrii Sybiha and the Ukrainian head of the presidential office, Andrii Yermakweek, and agreed to a deal that calls for a renewable 30-day cessation of combat operations along the entire front line, a moratorium on long-range missile and drone strikes, and a cessation of operations in the Black Sea. This proposal also assumes the continuation of U.S. intelligence sharing and U.S. and other military assistance to Ukraine. Coming out of that meeting, Secretary Rubio was cautiously optimistic that it laid the framework for a lasting peace in Ukraine, but he admitted that ultimately success depended on Russia agreeing to the terms outlined by the United States and Ukraine. Quote, "We will know what the impediment is to peace in Ukraine if Putin rejected the ceasefire proposal." Yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin did in fact reject that ceasefire proposal, saying that while the idea itself is correct, the cessation of hostilities, quote, "should be such that it would lead to long-term peace and eliminate the initial causes of the war," end quote, which are the issues that led to the conflict in the Donbass in 2014, as well as the threat of NATO expansion further eastward to include Ukraine. Meanwhile, during an Oval Office meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, President Trump said the following when asked by a reporter what sort of agreement he hoped to come away from ceasefire negotiations with.
I'd like to see a ceasefire from Russia. And we have, not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost and all of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who's going to get the power plant and who's going to get this and that? And so, it's not an easy process.
Trump showed his hand there specifically with the demands that are being placed on the Ukrainians. As he puts it, pieces of land that will be kept and lost. It's worth reviewing how the war has unfolded land-wise since the initial invasion. Here's a time-lapse created by ISW that shows how it started along the northern border, but within 2 months the Russian forces were pushed out, and then the focus shifted to the east, where it's been more or less a stalemate for 3 years. So when Trump mentions pieces of land that will be lost, and by lost he means lost by Ukraine, he's referring to the light red area here on the latest battle map. And the power plant in question is a Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the Kherson Oblast that is a keynote in the national grid that's changed hands several times since the original invasion and is now under Russian control. So in Trump's mind, Ukraine is going to have to accept that the light red regions on the battle map are lost to Russia, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which President Zelensky has previously stated was unacceptable, not to mention that among his conditions for the end of the war is reestablishing Ukraine's borders to where they were in 2014, including all of the separatist regions and Crimea. But as recently demonstrated, Zelensky's negotiating position is greatly reduced by an American president who's willing to completely end any U.S. support to continue the fight.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
On the other side of the equation, as U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff landed in Moscow, Putin offered an alternative ceasefire agreement that would grant Russia disproportionate advantage over Ukraine, the kind that create conditions for a future attempt to obtain the original invasion goal, which is the balance of Ukraine and not just the light red areas on the battle map. Putin's initial counter to the U.S.-Ukraine ceasefire agreement requires no peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, that NATO close the door to making Ukraine a member, that all supporting nations pause military assistance to Ukraine, and that Ukraine stops recruiting and training personnel. Putin did not suggest that Russia would also cease military recruitment efforts, the production of military equipment, and the receipt of military aid from Russia's allies. Russia's ability to continue these measures during a potential ceasefire while preventing Ukraine from doing so would allow Russia to resume offensive operations with better manned and equipped units at a time of its choosing. And the potential for that remains of concern to America's NATO allies, particularly those on or near the Ukrainian border. In the Oval Office meeting with the Secretary General, a reporter asked Trump about those concerns.
Mr. President, some of our allies have said that they're worried that they could be the next to be attacked by Russia. You've spoken directly with the Russian president. Do you think those fears are justified?
No, I don't. I think when this gets done, it's done. They're going to all want to go home and rest. I don't see it happening. Nope, I don't see that happening. And we'll make sure it doesn't happen. Not going to happen, but we'll make sure it doesn't happen.
As Secretary Rubio said coming out of the meeting with the Ukrainian delegation in Saudi Arabia, once Russia weighs in, we will know what the impediment is to peace. And Putin's counterdemands to the ceasefire agreement don't sound like a guy who wants to go home and rest. All right, that'll do it for this episode. We'll continue to keep a close eye on the situation as we have since the initial invasion. So if you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.